coming, and I'd like to welcome Jagadish with his presentation, which we were planning for so long, and it touches all these interesting issues of climate change, food security, STS, everything. So please, the floor is yours.
Thanks a lot, Janissa. I know we're going through back and forth over trying to find. So I'm going to present on some work that Mohan and I have been conducting in South India, in Pastapur, which is about 100 kilometers from the capital city of Hyderabad. No more, I mean, there's a new state now. But they're going to be shared capital city. So what I'll do is I'll try to speak for like 20 to 30 minutes, and then we'll open up for discussion. I'll take the easy questions, Mohan will take the tough questions, I believe. So I want to start with trying to... Perhaps I'll start with talking about my own experience going to a village and talking to the women farmers. I'm like an urban fool when I went there. We usually say rural fool coming to the urban areas and jaywalking and stuff like that. So I was the urban fool who went to this rural areas. I didn't know the name of these seeds. All my life I consumed rice, which I didn't know was not a native crop of the region, which comes from more irrigated water areas. So this was kind of a lot of discovery for me, and these women farmers were very patient with me, trying to explain everything. So that's kind of a context that I want to set in. So I stayed in Pastapur for about 2 months, and we did interview about like 28 women farmers, and I also participated in their biodiversity festival. So they go around village to village, and they have associations, about 70 villages. So they go from village to village where they showcase the seeds that they've been collecting. And this is a photo of a seed bank. So I'll talk about the seed bank a little later. So for an outline, I'll basically give a brief review of mainstreaming gender in climate change adaptation literature, followed by how we're going to introduce a culture-centered approach to whole climate adaptation literature, focusing on 3 different issues. And finally, I'll talk about the work in progress that we're doing with Deccan Development Society Sangams, which is collectives. So unless you're a Republican, a hardcore Republican, you're most likely to believe that climate change is real, it's happening, it's human caused, and unless we mitigate and adapt to it urgently, humanity is going to face some severe losses. Although global warming is global in nature, we know that certain countries, specifically countries in Asia, are more vulnerable to it because of high exposure, high sensitivity, lack of assets. So as you can see, and this I got it from the International Disaster Database, and we find that if you look at the natural disaster, which according to the IPCC latest report is going to increase in intensity and frequency, we find that the Asian countries are more vulnerable and they have seen a lot of mortality. Although the natural disasters do not affect everyone equally, what we know is that 70% of women die, more than men die because of natural disasters. So there's kind of an unequal balance where women get impacted more than men. This is not only just during disasters, but post-disasters too. Women find it more difficult to get back to life. Few of us have followed the Philippines Typhoon Haiyan, and there's, even after a couple of months, there's still, the disaster is a long way, the recovery is still a long way, and there's this fear, at least in the UN reports, that this disaster is going to lead an increase in sex trafficking in the Philippines region. So there's a different context to which we need to understand these natural disasters. And we know that there are no more natural disasters in a sense that they are kind of combined by climate change. And this whole issue, when we try to look from a climate justice point of view, we're asking these countries and the people in these countries to adapt for a thing that they haven't caused. So there's a whole climate justice angle to, who should be paying up, who should be adapting, who should be mitigating. And what we found in the literature review is that women have little opportunity to frame development policies, and same thing has continued over with the climate change policies. And the policies, some of the studies that I've done have shown that policies that do not focus on gender-specific impacts tend to perpetuate gender inequalities and increase the vulnerability of women. So here we come to a kind of do a culture-centered approach to climate change adaptation. And going back to Mohan's work, we know that communication disenfranchisement takes place hand in hand with structural disenfranchisement. That is, people who have silenced are more likely to be less heard in policy circles, taken up seriously, where they are given equal footing in deciding what policies to adapt and to check if the policies have benefited different social strata. And the whole work of culture structure agency comes from feminist studies, post-colonial studies, where we try to center our knowledge building exercise ground up. That is, we talk to the communities and see how they experience, for example, in this case, how they experience climate change impacts and what kinds of policies that they support. So there are three main points that I would highlight in the literature. One is to look at adaptation within the relations of power and decision-making process. That is, who gets to decide what kind of impacts that we should adapt, what kind of policies we should be taking into consideration, and how will we evaluate the impact of such policies. The second is to look at, and in the literature you see that many feminist studies have done, and they found that women, especially in the global south, are often portrayed as either vulnerable or virtuous. Vulnerable in the sense of they are poor, they can't, they need some support, and as well as virtuous in the sense that that's from Chipko. There's a photograph from Chipko movement, the tree hugging movement, where they are protectors of environment. But both these kind of discourses displaces more important things like what is the woman's role in policy making process and what are the impacts of such policies on gender. And we know from post-colonial studies that this whole vulnerability frame kind of rationalizes the external top-down kind of interventions where people are evaluating the effectiveness of such interventions, thereby further marginalizing the voices of poor and the vulnerable. And the third point is that we need to look at agriculture specifically in the broader context of structural changes that are happening. So one is that a majority of women are engaged in agriculture. In India, the figure apparently is as high as like 60 to 70%. Most of them work as agricultural laborers. Most of them don't own the farm, so they often work in farms of the husband. So where they don't have complete control on what kind of crops grow, where does the crops end up, kind of stuff. The second is that there's an increasing miniaturization of farmland. India, about 70% of all landowners in India are own less than a hectare, and we don't have, specifically in climate change, Indian government has a climate change policy, but in agriculture it does not talk about the small landowners at all. So that's like a big gap. And third is the withdrawal of state funding from research, which gives way to a lot of these biotech companies to jump in and use the whole climate change climate change disaster frame to push in their products. And Monsanto has like a lot of work on, climate change is happening, there's increasing population at the same time, so we need to increase the yields. How are we going to do that? Through scientific interventions. At the same time, at the UN level, they have introduced REDD, which is reducing emissions from deforestation, forest degradation, where rich countries can pay poor countries to protect the forest. And this is kind of called carbon offsetting. Where what eventually happens is that the state is getting all the money, and the people who live around this forest or who have been sustaining all this forest don't get access to it. They're denied access to the forest produce. So there's a whole complete different dimension on how international policies kind of affect the local indigenous groups from access to common property resources that they have been surviving on for many generations. So we picked up on those kind of three key themes, and then we also found that there are a lot of this, I don't want to call that term, but kind of armchair feminist studies which do not kind of foreground the living experience of the women farmers. So we kind of started off from that angle, that let's talk to women farmers, let's see what kind of climate change impacts that they are perceiving and what kind of policies that they support. So we were very fortunate, I would say, to get to know this organization called Deccan Development Society, which basically works in cooperatives. They work in about 70 villages in Medak district, and they have about 5,000 women farmers. Earlier, you need to pay 1 rupee to be part of the group. Now it's about 5 rupees to be part of the group, and you get kind of many benefits to be part of the group. And I'll briefly talk about that next. I think the central philosophy of the Deccan Development Society, Sangam's, is autonomous community, that people should have control over food production, over the seeds, over natural resources, market, and finally the media. So we interviewed about 30 women farmers, both one-on-one interviews and focus groups, trying to understand how they perceive climate change, what kind of impacts climate change is having on their lives, and what kind of solutions they like to see. One of the interesting things, and they've done lots of things. So firstly, these women are lower caste women. They come from scheduled tribes, scheduled castes. They are mostly landless. So, and DDS has been working there for over 30 years, and they started doing different kinds of activities. First, they started giving money to these landless farmers to lease land, and then they would give some loans so that they could, pick up the rocks and try to make the soil more useful for agriculture. And then they would also loan seeds to these landless farmers so they can, grow the crops. But there's one condition, is that they should not add any fertilizers or external fertilizers, only use the natural manure. So that kind of thing that they did. And they don't give loans to one person, they usually give loans to a group of 5 to 15 people. So they've been doing that kind of work, and I'll quickly show you a short video on the seed bank.
అదే దీని పిల్లలకు పెట్టుకొని పోదాం అని గోడలు అల్పబోతే దాని మీద తినబెల్ల కొట్టినే నేను పొద్దున్నకి చాలా తగ్గింది కదా.
25 ఏళ్ల కింద మేము చాలా పరిస్థితి ఖరాబ్ ఉన్న మంది ఉంటున్నాం. అయితే అప్పుడు 25 ఏళ్ల కింద ఈ డిడిఎస్ సంఘం వచ్చింది మన దగ్గర. మేము 1-2 రూపాయలు జమ చేసుకుంటుంటాం. జమ చేసుకొని దాని తర్వాత కూడా మేము ఈ జమ ఒకటే కాకుండా పైసలే కాకుండా తిప్పలు ఒక్కలము మాట్లాడుతుంటాం అన్నట్లు గుంపులో కూర్చొని మాట్లాడుకొని ఎవరి బాధలు ఎట్లున్నాయి అనేది తీసుకొని మేము ఒక గుంపు పెద్ద గుంపులాగా తయారు చేసుకొని ఇంకా ముందుకు నడిపించుకుంటున్నాం.
దీంట్లో మా ముందున్న పెద్ద సమస్య ఆకలి. దీన్ని ఏ విధంగా దూరం చేయాలని అందరం ఆలోచించాం. మేము చిన్న చిన్న రూపాయలు దాచిపెట్టినాం కాబట్టి దీంతో కలిసి డిడిఎస్ దగ్గర నుండి అప్పు తీసుకొని కోపిన్ బియ్యం కొనుక్కోవాలని ఆలోచించాం. కోపిన్ బియ్యం వస్తే కూడా కొనుక్కుందామంటే మా దగ్గర పైసలు ఉండకుండి.
Scoping BM is the government-sponsored public distribution system where people who have below the poverty card can go and buy subsidized food. Often there are complaints that the food that they receive is of bad quality. The storekeeper often sells that stock in the private market, often denying the people their rightful access to the food.
చాలా సార్లు మా బియ్యం వాపస్ పోతుంది. సంఘం పైసలు వాడేది సురువు చేసిన తర్వాత మేమందరం ప్రతి నెల 25 కిలోల బియ్యం కొనుక్కొని మా ఆకలిని ఎల్లగొట్టగలిగాం. కొన్నేళ్ళు అయినాక ఈ బయట కొనుడు ఎలాగైనా బంద్ చేయాలి, మా తిండి మనమే పండించుకోవాలని ఆలోచించాం. అదేవిధంగా 1987లో ఎండాకాలం పని అనే ప్రోగ్రాంని ప్రారంభించాం. దీని ద్వారా డిడిఎస్ ప్రతి మెంబర్కు ఒక్క ఏడాదిలో 100 రోజుల పనిని కలిగించాలనుకున్నాం. ఆ పని ద్వారా మా భూములన్నీ మంచిగా చేసుకోవాలని అనుకున్నాం.
పేదోళ్ళము ఆడోళ్ళము వీళ్ళతో భూమి ఎక్కడిది అని మీరు అనుకుంటుండొచ్చు, కానీ ఇదొకది మాది చరిత్ర. అయితే కాపోతా బండి వెళ్తా ఇట్లా పని చేసుకుంటా, వాళ్ళ గోధుమ పెట్టుకుంటా, వాళ్ళ ఇంట్లో పని చేసుకుంటా, వాళ్ళ చేలుల్లో కూలి చేసుకుంటా వండుకుంటూ ఉండగా ఈనాడు గుడ్డాలని కూలి బదిలి గుడ్డాలు ఇచ్చింది. ఆ గుడ్డాలలో పని చేసుకుంటూ ఉండగా ఇంద్రమ్మ అని గవర్నమెంట్ వచ్చింది. ఆ గవర్నమెంట్ వచ్చినప్పుడు పేదోళ్ళకు పేదోళ్ళకు చూసి
ఒక ఎకరా 2 ఎకరాలు అట్లనే చేయించారు మాకు.
వంజరా భూమిచ్చినారు గింజములువా నీరు లేదు వంజరా భూమిచ్చినారు గింజములువా నీరు లేదు.
అయితే ఈ భూములన్నీ చాలా ఖరాబ్ భూములు, రాళ్ళు రప్పలతోని నిండిపోయి దున్ననికి రానట్టు కలవనికి రానట్టు ఉండే భూములు. ఈ భూములు మావి అయితే కూడా మాకేం పంట రాకుంది. మా ఎండాకాలం పని ఈ భూముల మీద సులువు చేసినాం. దాంట్లో ఉన్న రాళ్ళన్ని ఏరేసినాము, గండ్లు కాలువలేసినాము, బండ భూముల మీద మట్టి పోసుకున్నాం. ఈ అన్ని పనులతోని ఏం పండని మా చేన్లల్లా 3 సంచుల దాకా జొన్నలు, సంచి తొగాళ్ళు, 2-3 అడ్ల వేరే చిల్లర పంటలు పండినాయి. ఏ తిండి లేనోళ్ళము ఏడాదికి 8 నెలలు ఇంటి తిండి తినగలిగింది. బయట నుండి తిండి కొనుడు 12% బంద్ అయింది.
మా పేదల సంఘాలలో మంచి పంటలు పెట్టి
So the seed bank I was referring to plays a very important role here because they loan people seeds and people can they have to repay back the loan in seeds. So they store seeds which are helpful for them to keep on going, and that also sort of preserves the kind of biodiversity that's in the region because of saving the seeds. And that the next one is a kind of cart that they go around in 70 different villages carrying. So based on the interviews that we did, we kind of some of the themes that were more prominent in the interviews have been highlighted here. So let's first talk about the perceptions of changing climate. How do these women farmers see? So when we asked them about have they observed any changes in the environmental patterns, we found that unanimous answer that the annual rainfall has been decreasing over the past 10 years. For example, one woman farmer said that because 10 years ago the rainy season used for a longer duration and not like nowadays. 10 years ago, if it rained for 2 or 3 months, the soil used to get muddy, although our soil is hard and dry and we won't be able to walk. When it rains now, it is merely a sprinkle. We are just able to see 2 or 3 heavy rains in the period of 4 months of the rainy season. There are no heavy rains anymore. And it's very interesting, and I asked them how do they judge if the rainfall pattern has increased or decreased. And apart from the direct impact on agriculture, they describe various visual cues that they observe and the various metaphors that these people use to describe heavy rainfall. For example, one metaphor is the umbrella got wet. It rained so much that the umbrella got wet. Another was that it rained so much that the canals overflew. Or it rained so much that when we were not able to work in the fields anymore. Or it rained so much that we could not even walk even with our slippers in the fields. So they kind of both visual cues and direct experience that they use to judge the annual rainfall patterns. Similarly, they also spoke about increasing unpredictability of rainfall patterns. Now usually the custom is you kind of sow seeds just before monsoons, but because monsoons have become increasingly unpredictable or when they will start, so people are kind of confused about whether they should plant before or whether they should plant after the rains have come, and that kind of impacts yields. Very interestingly, and this was referred in the last IPCC report, is unpredictability in the pest attacks. Now, because of the changing rainfall season has a complex relationship with the pest, so sometimes it increases, sometimes it decreases, and that has a great impact on the yields that women farmers grow. So the next question would be what are these women farmers doing to adapt to this increasing erratic rainfall? And what they say is that they have been planting a variety of climate resilient crops. So they plant some crops that can withstand a lot of rainfall and some plants that can withstand scant rainfall. As one woman farmer said, if we plant rice, which is not a native to this region, it's a semi-arid region without much rainfall, we need more rain and more water. If we plant jonalu, cereals, sajjalu, which requires very less water, even if there is less rainfall, we can still harvest some crops. We are confident that the kinds of crops we grow can tolerate low rainfall. We have hard soil here, so janna, sajja suits this region. Even if it rains more, some crops such as janna does not give good yields. Togar, which is red gram crop, needs more water. So some crops can tolerate more rain and others less rain. So when we plant these variety of crops, we at least get 2 bags of yields when it rains less than usual instead of 4 bags of normal rainfall. So by they kind of talking in terms of they're distributing their risks to say it in the insurance language. Moreover, planting this kind of diverse crops also helps them to, bring nutrition to their families, having these different kinds of crops and in different times of the year. Next, one of the important questions that emerged was, what is the relationship of women with agricultural practices? And I think this is one of the important themes. And what we found is that they are very interlinked. Women having access and power over their farms and its produce, and what happens with the produce are very important question that relates back to their own nutrition and that of their families. As one woman farmer said, why? Because men often go only for one kind of a crop, monoculture. That crops, they sell it in the market, but women think in many different angles. She will think about cultivating spices for home, and they keep going to the field often. When they go to the field, they often take some goat or buffalo along with them. That way, as they go often, they get a lot of work done. So, if there is a relationship with land, they can do good farming. And similarly, having this kind of control over the farm and its produce provides more equity in household decision making. They can decide, what should be done with the extra money. Otherwise, it's usually the men whose rule goes on in the home. Next theme that emerged was, why is it important for them to have this control over farms, seeds, and market? And one of the women farmers said that because at the time we did not till our own lands, we did not have seeds. So we always used to work in rich landlords' farms as agricultural labor. So we would work all day long, and whatever we earn, we come back and cook with that. But after working in DDS Sangams, we feel that if I own my own field, I can grow my own crops. Why should I go and work in other people's farm? So there's a whole kind of social change where these poor women farmers who used to work for rich landlords, now they are able to produce from their own food and able to feed their families. They are no longer dependent on this upper caste for money, for food, stuff like that. If we grow our own food and eat, as another woman farmer said, we'll have better health. It's good for the earth. It's good for our animals. So there's a kind of synchronous relationship between women farmers, the sovereignty over seed and food, and the health of their families. Finally, we talked about what kind of adaptation policies that they would like to see, and Mohan was there in this board meeting. So one woman farmer immediately shouted, "Will you care to listen?" There's this kind of skepticism with these women farmers that people come and go, government officials keep coming and going, but they still don't take this policy seriously. So they did a documentary on BT cotton when it was first introduced in Andhra Pradesh. Andhra Pradesh is one of the big cotton growing areas. And this is what she said: we have done a documentary about BT cotton in Warangal 7 to 8 years ago. Government listened to us, but the government banned BT cotton crop for only 1 year. Then we don't know what kind of internal discussion they had. It got released again. How can we be sure that they listen to us? So when we asked them what would listening mean to them, another woman farmer said that the government should recommend our farming techniques and crops. Our crops should get better market rates, or in other matters, our seed should get preference. Anyone who is doing this kind should get recognition. Recognition means that you give others subsidy, we should also get subsidy, and that's the forward-looking policy. Only when they do that, we will know that they have listened. So right now what's happening is that if a farmer wants to go for a cash crop, there are all kinds of incentives and subsidies available. You can get a loan in the bank to buy the seeds, to dig a bore well. And if your crop, there's a loss of crop, you already have a rich agriculture, people who have already invested in that, so they can pressurize the government to give some kind of compensation. But for these farmers, they're focused on food crops, and because they can't read or write, they can't go to a government office and say, well, we lost so much crop. In fact, they had to make a documentary of standing crops and the crops lost due to rain and show it, and that was the only proof that the government was willing to accept that the crops were destroyed. So very, very important, and we have done a white paper, and you can take a look on the whole BT cotton debate that's going on. We did a kind of review of studies to check if the grand success story that BT cotton has talked about, how much of it is real. So finally, there's one quick slide on unequal benefits of government policies. So the Indian government has launched about 10 years ago a 100-day work guarantee program, whereby people who are jobless can apply to the government, and government is supposed to give 100-day work. Now again, there's a lot of corruption. Women don't get paid as much as men do, and those are the other issues. But one of the issues that one woman farmer said was that they don't, the government programs don't help them to improve their lands. The lands that get improved are those of rich landlords. The lands around the rich landlords' farms, there's a lot of cleaning of stones, water canals being built there. So there's whole kind of inequity even in the government adaptation policies. So just to summarize kind of from this work in progress, what we came to know from these interviews, it's a complex dynamic process where climate change adaptation takes place, from gender equality, local agricultural practices, government policies, and the rainfall patterns. So the biggest takeaway for us was that adaptation is a local affair and need for localized solutions. Unfortunately, that does not figure so much in the global UN conferences that take place every year. As I mentioned before, there's a Prime Minister's Action Plan on Climate Change, and he got 25 experts to come and help him frame that. 24 of those experts are in New Delhi, with one expert, Ratan Tata, who's a big industrialist situated in Mumbai. So the national policy on climate change was done by these experts sitting in New Delhi, who we don't even know how much they kind of know about. So there is clearly lack of voice of these women farmers, not just from the south, but I think in different parts of India.
So have any of these experts practiced agriculture?
No, they are all associated with big. For example, there is Jyoti Parekh, who runs she writes a lot on gender and climate justice, but she runs her own institute on economic statistics kind of thing. And most of them are, another person is Navroz Dubash, who is educated in US, and he runs the Center for Policy, so they're totally unconnected with agricultural practices, and most of them come from, like us, educated abroad. So it's important that who controls farm and its produce controls health and nutrition of the family. And unfortunately, and this you see not just here, but community participation has been more of a way of talking rather than doing, and we hope the project that we are doing in South India would kind of change that. It will be more about doing rather than talking. I'd like to finally finish with showing a small video. So concurrently, these women farmers have started their own community media. In fact, going back in 1998, they got funding from UNESCO to start a community radio. And at the time when the Indian government did not have a community radio policy, so these women farmers, they helped in framing the government community radio policy that came in effect only in 2006. And then there are all kinds of rules. So for example, if you want to start a community radio, you have to pay 2.5 lakhs. So that basically says that only universities or people who can afford can start community radio. And second is that they can't broadcast news. So they can, of course, relay the news that the national televisions deliver, but they can't have their own news. So why would a farmer be interested in which actress is dating which actor? So that's kind of big fight that's going on in trying to make the community radio more free from the clutches of the government. So they do love these documentaries, as I said before, and here's a quick bite.
నేను ఇంతకు ముందు ఊళ్ళో ఇట్లా వ్యవసాయం పని కలవనికి అట్లా కూలి పనికి పోతుంటే అనమాట. కూలి పనికి పోకుండా అట్లనే ఇప్పుడు కెమెరా నేర్చుకోవడం జరిగింది. ఇది అంటే ఏంటిది, కెమెరా అంటే ఏంటిది అంటే ఏదో నెలం ఇప్పుడు ఈ కెమెరా పట్టి తీస్తున్నాము. ఈ కెమెరాతోనే ఇప్పుడు మేము కొంతమందికి ట్రైనింగ్ విని ఇస్తున్నా అన్నమాట. నేను ఇప్పుడు పేరు దేశం అన్న దేశంలో 18 మంది అడవిళ్ళలో ఆలుగిన మాయా సొంటలు ఊరోళ్ళు ఆడేళ్ళు ఆ సొంటలకు మేము ఈ కెమెరా గురించి నేర్పినాం. అయితే అక్కడ పోయి షూటింగ్ దాని గురించి నేను ఇక్కడికి వెళ్ళి ఎందుకు పోతుంటే ఇది నేర్చుకున్న కాబట్టి నేను ఆ దేశం పోయిన ఈ కెమెరా నేర్చుకునేప్పటికి ఇది ట్రైనింగ్ ఇచ్చిన అంటేనే నాకు ఎంతో మంచిగా అనిపిస్తుంది. ఎందుకంటే నేను ఎక్కడ కలవరబట్టి కలిసేటామెను ఆ దేశం పోయి నేను చూస్తానా. ఇప్పుడు ఇది నేను నేర్చుకున్నాక వేరే వేరే చోట్ల దిక్కు విన పోయి షూటింగ్ చేసినాం అన్నమాట. ఇట్లా బంగ్లాదేశ్, పాకిస్తాన్, నేపాల్, శ్రీలంక ఇట్లా వ్యవసాయం మీద మొత్తానికి ఇట్లా షూటింగ్ చేస్తుంటే ఇప్పుడు కెనడా, పెరు, మళ్ళా ఇట్లా లండన్ అట్లా పోయినప్పుడు ఇప్పుడు ఈ కెమెరాతో మాకు ఎక్కువ సంబంధాలు పెరిగినాయి, ఎక్కువ మర్యాదలు పెరిగినాయి, ఎక్కువ ఊళ్ళో మంది తెలుసు.
So, Chinna Narasimha in fact went to the conference of parties, COP15 in Copenhagen, which was a big event because heads of the state came together, and because they were denied permission to enter these, these meetings, closed door meetings, they all burned their badges, and that's kind of a protest. Thank you so much for listening, and looking forward to your suggestions and questions.
Any questions, comments?
It was so clear. Yes, sir.
Yeah, I have got questions, couple of comments. I've worked with the International Crop Research Institute, ICRISAT in Hyderabad for and with many years. So I know a bit about these areas and the issues. So there are two issues that I wanted to sort of flag. One is something that you mentioned in your presentation, the issue of predictability. Now, a lot of research in India, including by organizations like CRIDA in Hyderabad, and by meteorologists, others, have shown that one of the main problems with reference to agriculture and climate change in India is that climate variability is the problem, not quite climate change. And climate variability has already been quite high in semi-arid and arid areas in terms of drought, temperature changes, rainfall patterns and so on. And that is becoming even more unpredictable. So in that context, having these kinds of seed banks becomes much more important. And it's not just the question of having a diversity of crops, but also having a diversity of varieties for each crop. So this is something that we documented in a study 15 years ago in Rajasthan, where again women were able to save seeds, multiple kinds of seeds of the same crop, and depending on when the rainfall would arrive and the quantity of rainfall and the temperature and drought and all of that, they would decide what to go in for. And here, so it's a combination of indigenous knowledge and knowledge which comes in from outside that becomes important, because in some contexts the research that came from outside, from universities, from private seed companies, from government research organizations, were also found to be useful. But the decision had to be left to them, not to market forces out of the government. The second aspect was about the BT cotton that you mentioned, and I wanted to raise a larger issue about gender and agricultural biotechnology. In general, it seems to be that because agricultural biotechnology is so much under the control of corporate firms, it may enhance control over agriculture and farmers lose control. But given the context of the feminization of agriculture in countries like India, there are other perspectives which are coming in. So there are very interesting articles by Govind Kelkar, who used to be based here in Bangkok for many years, and Gail Ombet, among others, and also by Swasti Meter. So they are raising these questions about what kind of technologies will empower women, and what kind of research therefore needs to be done. So in the case of BT cotton and other biotechnology varieties, what they suggest is that because on the one hand there is feminization of agriculture taking place, because men are migrating, it's more, the farms are under the control of women, but women don't have property rights, which means that they cannot access credit, they cannot access knowledge, they cannot go for training programs and so on. But still have to work with that land to get something out of it. Okay, so in that context, there is this need to improve productivity, but not having all the rights that men have. So technology, they argue, can play a role, and biotechnology can, if it is properly planned, if it is properly designed, then it can help them overcome some of the problems that they face as women. But they also have another feminist kind of perspective to offer here, that indigenous technologies may give them control, but usually indigenous knowledge is tied to traditional patriarchal systems. So do you want to break that? Okay, that's the kind of question there is also. So indigenous knowledge cannot be seen in isolation from the other kinds of social structures that exist.
Yeah, I think that's a very important point about what role can researchers play, especially agricultural research can play in helping the indigenous populations. Specifically, as you mentioned, it's a very socially divided Indian society, especially in rural areas. That's an important question here. But as you know, for example, early varieties of hybrid cotton was released by, I'm not sure if ICRISAT did it.
They don't work on cotton.
So
They
Cotton
only work on
Research.
so millets and so on.
Yeah, the Cotton Research Institute, I think they released hybrid varieties.
Yes.
And that has kind of completely gone off. Now we have only BT varieties,
Yes.
completely owned by corporations. So
Yes.
there's a complete decrease, they step back from what agricultural institutions that get public funding do for that money. But yeah, I think your point is very well taken.
I have two questions for you. The first one is, you ended with a slide talking about the women's response in terms of, are you going to listen? And you made a reference to the fact that researchers are people that come and go. So I'm wondering, how is this so different? And what is it that you and Mohan are planning to do that is going to make it different, so that you could really answer that question, and not by saying, yes, we're listening, but in action?
So
that's the first question.
Okay.
And
all right. So the way that this project is going on, we're trying to do a campaign. Although already these women farmers know how to shoot, they have their own community radio. So we're kind of working them for a communication campaign to do two things. One is trying to encourage farmers not to plant BT cotton but plant food crops, because a semi-arid region, as I said, the high variability of rainfall, so they're high risk, and people are taking those kind of high risk. In fact, Andhra Pradesh has seen one of the highest suicide rates, mostly among BT cotton farmers. So what we're doing is a communication campaign where we're trying to encourage other farmers to go for less risky crops, food crops. Another thing that we are trying to do is kind of engage the local government to provide some kind of benefits. For example, it could be in terms of token amount that they can get, or recognition as as biodiverse farm. In fact, they recently got some kind of token amount, I think about 500 rupees per year. So we're trying to work with the local government as well, trying to have some kind of funds set up for these women farmers to do. So that's in the short term. In the long term, I hope we'll be able to, and I guess this is going over the head, but trying to see if we can influence the whole climate change document that the Prime Minister has published, and that the state governments are also expected to publish their state action plans on climate change. So we will see if we can able to go so far.
But talking about the BT cotton or the local policy, or even does that really get to what the women are saying in terms of really hearing, not only listening, but hearing what they are really saying is the problem? Because that connects to my second question, which is that it seems to me that there is a lot of, obviously, structural deprivation and structural violence in terms of the context, but it seems to be related more to their other aspects in their life than really so much about the climate. Right? From the examples that you've used, and from your own response to what you're going to be doing, it really seemed, and so I'm trying to figure out, like, what about the climate is it really affecting their lives and their livelihood, when in fact contextually, right, that's their interpretation of what is going on, but not other than the rainfall, right? There is not much in terms of the examples that you've used, that really says, okay, right, there's that connection that we should maybe talk about the policy, or even maybe the other aspect is the policy impact of this policy that you said, okay, these people in Delhi made this up, but does it have an impact on them, so that you can connect it to this idea of climate change. So I'm trying to figure out how all those things come together.
Oh, I think it does make an impact, the policies that get framed. So one of the things that they've been fighting on is to make millets part of the public distribution system. So the public distribution system in India, which is like central government, they procure the grains and distribute. That's heavily based on rice and wheat. So what they are saying is, if you can include millets, so they will have a kind of a ready market to sell their whatever extra that comes. So there's clearly a big relationship between that. In fact, they started the whole alternate public distribution system scheme in early 2000s. What they did was they provided money, loan for the landless people to lease some land. They provided them seeds, and then all the food that would grow, they would come together, and the poorest people in the village would be identified, and they would get the first right over this food. So, of course, what policies happen in the central government have an impact in local. And second thing is, I think agriculture plays a central role in the structural transformation, in the sense that who owns the farm, who manages the produce, has direct implications within the household power relationship, as well as if they can go and access credit from the banks, if they can get access information.
I understand all of that, but what I'm saying is, how does that all connect to your discussion of climate change?
So climate change, as you know, as I briefly mentioned, it's used as a kind of a discourse to kind of sell all kinds of things. For example, we need to grow yields, so let's go for genetically modified crops. In fact, there's a whole big debate on genetically modified brinjal, which the government said yes. Some of the scientists said yes, let's do it, and it got only stalled, and it did not get rejected. It got only stalled for some period of time. So there's this relation on what kind of crops that the government wants to see. So there's kind of, I feel that there's a direct engagement with the kind of changes that we want to see, both structural.
Actually, that's a very interesting point you're bringing about this relation between corporatization of that discourse on climate change and how it's used to basically enable these Monsantos and big companies to take power over the agriculture, and it's not just India. And I think there would be nice if there's some literature or research done that can actually show that direct link, how more discourse on climate change actually doesn't lead to enabling these communities to get power in their hands, but actually enables the government to create these policies which support the interests of quite a few very powerful corporations. And my question in that respect would be, what is the research landscape in agriculture in India or around that region? Because I actually do believe biotechnologies can help. Unfortunately for everyone, they are just hacking plants is very difficult and complicated. They are genetically very complex, and it is a research, what I understand, which is quite intensive in terms of investment. So are there any independent research institutes that are trying to do, connect the indigenous knowledge of some crops with some potential ways of enhancing these qualities of such more adaptable crops? What is the situation in India? Are these research institutes more independent, or anything that can give us some hope?
Well, I think ICRISAT does quite some good work. So ICRISAT is located very close to where we have been working. So I think they work on millets.
Yes, and they provide them as global public goods.
Yeah.
They're not supposed to pay to.
So I think there are kind of these organizations, both in public sector and private, that they do, but they don't have that kind of influence, I believe, in trying to reshape the government policy. In fact, if you read the white paper, what we found is that most of the people who publish on BD Cotton are economists, not scientists. And economists, of course, they do their panel data and they find that income has grown up. So it's very interesting that economists are the kind of a forefront of this whole BD Cotton debate in India. And of course, the whole debate is that if you don't say yes to GM, you're anti-science, you're a poverty lover, kind of thing. Whereas the other side, they don't get published as often in literature. They have independent reports, but which are kind of dismissed by saying, oh, that's not peer review. So that's kind of interesting debate, and I think that's a good point to see if the increase in discourse on climate change what has it resulted? Has it resulted in increasing, corporatization of agriculture and the solutions that corporates wants to see? That's an interesting question. I just want to give you another example. For example, solar power. Solar power is good. India should be investing in solar power. But where has the investment of solar power gone? It has gone in mostly grid-connected electricity, whereas a lot of these villages in India are totally off-grid. So what was needed was to develop off-grid solar power, but that's not what the government is doing. The government is heavily investing in this large-scale solar projects that they want to connect it back to the electricity to supply to cities and industries. But the people who actually need the quiet kind of power, who haven't seen electricity in their lifetime, so again the whole issue gets kind of subsumed in the whole logic.
I mean, I seriously would like to see such study, because I think it can be like hugely influential if you're able, and it seems like you have all this anecdotal evidence and it's possible to make that claim, because this still reads like it still feels very technical. Okay. And I don't see the impact it can have, because like these are all amazing stories about self-empowerment. These groups are doing actually pretty well from what we see, and they just need a bit of support, or they just don't need some other big actors to mess up their system in some.
Right, yeah. I think a couple of researchers in Washington State University, whom I hope to meet during the ICA, who have been working on this whole pro-poor story, BD Cotton as a pro-poor story, and trying to deconstruct, for example, the studies that take place looking at Monsanto documents and the news stories. But I think there's still more work needs to be done, specifically looking at India, which is like a big market for these biotech companies. But yeah, that's a...
Yeah, I agree with you, right? I think that's what I was trying to get at too, was that the whole context of that relationship is missing. We understand the context and who they are, but not so much the impact that's happening, right? And so I think that's, the studies or evidence or things that link to that would help, I think, also understand why it's so significant to talk about it in that context, knowing that context from the video and the stories.
So yeah, I think I'll just make a quick point. So recently, the Confederation of Indian Industries invited this this guy who's just become chief minister in Delhi, and then he resigned. And what they want him to do is start a second green revolution, which is again highly fertilizer, chemically intensive agriculture, which we already know. Even the people who funded that kind of thing know that it's bad. So they want to start. So again, that gets subsumed with the whole climate change and the development discourse, where we need to get yields up, and how are we going to do that? There's only one way to do it. I think, but yeah, that's an interesting part. We'll try to work it.
I think that the whole policy and how climate change policy in India, the discourse is being shaped, and who are the actors and who are the ones who get to make those decisions, and what are the ways in which the stories are framed and presented, and where are the farmers themselves in that discourse can be the backdrop, or could be a separate study that kind of then you talk about the absence of these farmers who are small landowners, and they're doing a lot on their own. They're creating their own alternative things, but then this whole thing can be heavily suddenly changed and impacted if they're growing brinjal, and suddenly tomorrow there's a brinjal. They have no control over those kinds of aspects, right? So, like, I think whatever we're seeing here is to show that how those kinds of policies can have a very severe impact on these women, but they're doing things to kind of make sure that they have some agency, and the stories of empowerment. But still, there are things happening at the state level or international, global level that they need to know, and they need to be connected to that knowledge base. And I don't know if they're plugged into that discourse. And one way maybe that you can help is to also keep that channel of communication open, at least for them. See if you can create channels of communication where their voice reaches up to the top, and whatever discourse is happening at the central government level or state government level, whether that at least they're aware of what is happening.
Right. Not to speak highly of my own work, but we recently published an article called Shifting Discourse of Climate Change in India and Climatic Change, and we looked at the last 20 years of discourse in India, and that's one of the prominent themes is that we are not responsible, don't ask us to do anything. And that continued, even so far. So for example, there are a lot of studies in India talking about how the West responsible, we should not be doing anything unless you pay us some money. And there are hardly any studies on vulnerability. In fact, only in 2009, the Indian government instituted a group of scientists to look at vulnerability. So an issue as important as vulnerability was completely absent in the discourses. Even now, the vulnerability is a namesake. That is, the PM document starts with India as one of the more vulnerable countries, but we still don't have like indices on vulnerability, what pockets are more vulnerable, what kind of adaptation plans or policies should go to kind of vulnerability. So the whole vulnerability discourse is kind of, it's a namesake, it's a facade kind of a thing. But there is some movement, like for example, there's a climate justice movement. Again, unfortunately, there's one Delhi guy who is leading this, but he's trying to open it up, which kind of pressurizes the government in trying to actually act on climate change. That is, by reducing emissions, it's not only going to contribute globally, but to India itself, there's a lot of problems with health pollution, kind of thing. So yeah, I think you're right that we need to kind of start, at least strategically think about how to combine these different voices to be able to affect the government policy. Yeah.
And environmental journalism is not even a thing.
I know. So we interviewed one woman journalist who does a lot of environmental programs on CNN IBN, and within a month after we did the interview, she was fired because she did all this, environmental impacts surrounding big projects and how that's polluting Ganga and all that. And you know what? The people who sponsor the whole channel, they're like, oh, we don't need all that stories. We can keep away from that. So there are a lot of stories on Save the Tiger. Like that's the only environmental problem in India. So they'll have a 12-hour program on Save the Tiger. But what about Save the tribals, the indigenous populations? Yeah. So there's the corporate media, so we can't expect much from it. Come, sorry.
Yeah, I was wondering whether there are some central government actions or national scale participations or interventions so as to change this water distribution, like man-made reservoirs or lakes, things like that, so that the monsoon season water can be saved and used for the dry seasons. Are there any large projects like that?
So the central government, during a right-wing government's rule, proposed a project of interlinking rivers in India, which is like an environmental disaster. You can't just change the course of a river and say, well, why did you come here? Because what is required here? So that's one point, that they've tried it, but they are unsuccessful.
Change the course
of rivers.
Okay.
So that's one thing. Thankfully, they did not take off. And the second thing is, there's still kind of gender differences when the government tries to sponsor water, man-made lakes or man-made ponds kind of thing. Where do they get situated, and who benefits from those kind of water ponds? That's like a big debate. In fact, one of the women farmers were talking about, the government said like we'll build a tank here, but that's close to the rich farmlands, and my farm is really far away. So by the time the water trickles to my farm, the rich farmer, he'll get a electronic pump set, will dig in all the water kind of thing. In fact, there's a whole big fight in India on this water redistribution, and a lot of people are displaced because of the water distribution. So you want to build dams, generate electricity, but the people who have been living in the forests, they get totally submerged, and the water is completely diverted, towards urban areas, towards industry. In fact, there's a big debate that happened when. So the way the water is divided is domestic purposes, agriculture, and then industry. And then they try to overcome it. They said first domestic purposes, industry, and then agriculture. Then a lot of protests broke down, and the government had to turn over and make it like domestic purposes, agriculture, and industry. So water is kind of diverted towards a lot of these industries.
I see. So what you said seems to say that there are a lot of difficulties as for this national design and then projects over water redistribution. But then again, this can also show that they are urgent need for national planning and designing of such things or projects?
Yeah, I think there is an urgent need specifically to kind of store monsoon rains, because the runoff not only decreases the availability of water but leads also to soil erosion. So there is this urgent need, but I don't think there's like a. So the problem is, even if they have a plan, doesn't get implemented. If it gets implemented, there's different kinds of impacts. So we need to have there's an important role that local communities can play in trying to design these projects, although they might be funded from the central government.
Yeah, it seems that the first video you showed that there is a part when the women farmers were digging trench so that during the monsoon season their crops won't be flooded.
Right.
But then on the other hand, a lot of parts of your presentation is saying that the crop, when to sow the seeds depends on whether they have rainfall or something. So there's some like water or irrigation or rainfall. It seems that it has the two edges. One is that there's too much, that therefore it destroys, and therefore sometimes there's too little or none for their crops to grow. So I'm thinking of this out of context thing of man-made lakes or something, so as to equalize this water distribution over seasons, different seasons.
Yeah. I think Parthasarathi sir could correct me, but so for example, one of the big invisible problems is groundwater problem in India. So the rich landlords can easily get credit for putting a pump, and this is a common property resource, but it's not common anymore because the rich landlord will of course get more water, and so this water affects the kind of water in the people's common wells. Like people used to survive on wells earlier, but now they have the more and more dependent on private supply of water. Water is like the first wall that we will hit even before climate change, and we still haven't have a clear policy to talk about water.
Another one that might be connected to the history of India, which I do not know. That is the national land distribution. Also, one of the tapes showed that it first come by these rich landowners giving the land, the barren land, to the land farmers, like the farm laborers. So I don't know. It seems that on the one hand, these NGOs are doing small-scale work, giving women cameras, and then having these seed banks, and then which are changing in a macro scale lives of many people. But on the other hand, is there a national discussion of land redistribution or something like that?
Not anymore, I guess. I don't think it has become a big issue, and it hasn't. I mean, now we are more about development, market orientation, where we want to shift all these people who are practicing agriculture into industries, make them more skilled labor, as if agriculture is an unskilled profession. So the whole discourse, I don't think this is part of the main discourse at all. Land redistribution. I think that's gone. That's like 1970s.
Thank you.
I just wanted to add that actually millets comes from the word million, has the same root. Actually, even one millet has so much nutrition.
Oh, really? I didn't know that.
Urban food. Yeah. So we, even health-wise, to eat more millets is so much better.
Yes.
For health.
Yeah, so I participated in this they had a village discussion where, so they would draw lines and they would talk about each food and they would assign values. So is it good for health? Is it good for kids' health? Is it good for maternal health? And in that, the rice was the least highlighted thing, but everybody buys rice because it's cheap, it's available. So this kind of, we can't do it. We know it's not nutritious, but that's the only thing we can access. It's 2 rupees per kg, so it's easy for me to go access.
Even brown versus white rice.
Yeah.
Because of the public distribution system, now they started eating more white rice.
Right, and
because
all
brown rice is not.
Yeah, and all the diabetes could be related back to this.
Absolutely, but you know, in Indonesia, where I follow the Yogyakarta people, there was also a movement of some, I guess, researchers. I don't know the details. Started protesting against the white rice as a crops which didn't grow in Indonesia before, I think 60s or 70s, when one of these dictators basically decided, you know, this is what all other modern nations do, so we should eat more rice.
Yeah.
So it was like, now they're trying to also reverse it back to some indigenous crops, and they have this, I forgot what's the name. They have this one thing which was much more common to eat in Indonesia. And yeah, so it's this is really horrible. The white rice is just pure glucose. It's just pure sugars. It gives you cancer. It gives you all these bad things.
Don't tell me I eat white rice every day.
I mean, bread or rice is the same. It's bad.
Right,
Only
yeah.
these brown, more complex grains are actually healthy.
In fact, the whole why rice became such an important goes back to the first green revolution in 1980s in India, where, you know, a lot of irrigated land in North India, they grew so much rice. You know, what will you do about it? So make it part of this free distribution system. So rice that, you know, we eat comes from some other part of India. So China.
No, but I bet even in China it was much more diverse the types of rice you can get, because if you're into organic food, you see the variety of rice, from these black grains to red rice. And I think there was probably like that, like even in China people were growing all kinds of rice. And now we're, because of all these pressures to grow more, and somehow this matter of some apocalypse that will happen, it's often misused to just, you know, give a power to one company that will produce one type of rice and that's it.
Yeah.
And seriously, I haven't seen any, like a real study that will show there were these economic interests that pushed the agenda. And I mean, if you, what is the cost in terms of health? Like, I haven't seen any like really convincing studies that would link all these, because it's always like green revolution, more white rice, always good. It helped people survive and prevented hunger. But I don't know, you know, like I have no idea whether that's true, even.
No, even if that research exists, it's not being discussed or shared.
Yeah.
I remember Vandana, she was done some with Navadanya project.
Right, yeah.
To save biodiverse seeds and all that.
Yeah.
But that's often done in
very
this.
few.
Yeah, but it's Vandana is a typical case that irritates me. I'm sorry, like I put her in that context of these like eco-fanatics and, you know, these I love the earth, Mother Earth type of new age figures, and that, in my opinion, does more like bad things to the whole discussion rather than good, because she polarizes the whole. I don't know, like it's just an opinion from outside. I mean, it's so good that she exists and such people exist, because otherwise we'll be totally in the hands of Monsanto. But
No, she's a very, very good communicator, and you need someone who can strongly talk about these and give the statistics when you only hear 99% the other side. You don't hear.
Yeah, I guess you recently met her.
Yes.
Sorry.
So I just have a quick question. You talk about climate change, and in your interviews there was reference to rainfall. But the women never talk about changing temperatures and its effect on crops and things like that.
Well, they did. They talked about hot days, how hot days have become more frequent compared to the past. So I think the hot days and I guess rainfall are two big issues. Some talked about mosquito infestation becoming more, which, I mean, rising temperature kind of has a kind of link to mosquito-borne diseases. So yeah, they talk about these kind of two things. Another thing they also talked about is, so I asked them, why do you think the changes are happening? So then they would talk about, you know, what trees are being cut, more pollution, more kind of visible, right, more industries around, more urbanization around. So yeah, I think so the most important was about rainfall and the hot days becoming more frequent compared to the past. In fact, we did this survey called Climate Change in the Indian Mind a couple of years ago, and where we asked a list of questions on changes in the local weather patterns, including uncertainty of rainfall, increasing floods, droughts, hot days, have they increased or decreased compared to the past? And we find, for example, more than 50% of Indians whom we surveyed said the hot days have become more frequent compared to the past.
Did they also feel like it was hotter?
Yeah. So they described that experience as, now in summer when they go for work, it becomes very difficult for them to work compared to the past where they could have worked easily. So they talk that in terms of their experiences when they go for the work. But yeah, they do see that it's becoming hotter in summer and it becomes quite cold during winter. They talk in terms of winds as well, which I thought was very interesting. How if certain wind comes, they call it Jonagali, so related to the crop that they grow. So if that comes, it's good for the crops, it's good for health. But if other kind of wind comes, it's bad for the crops, bad for the health. So I thought, those.
We saw erosion is also one part of it. Like, one lady was saying that there was no topsoil. So if there is no topsoil, the land is more inclined towards this erosion.
Okay, but the lands that they were given barren, that they were left actually full of stones. So you need to have a surface layer to be able to grow crops. So they actually had to get soil and put it on this to be able to make it cultivable.
Yes.
I wanted to give a clarification about the comment you made on vulnerability.
Yeah.
There is quite a lot of research on vulnerability in India. I've been involved in some of them myself, and I was part of a team which compiled a handbook of tools on vulnerability. But the second part of what you said is right. The government absolutely ignores this research and doesn't convert them into strategies. So from the research perspective, there is a lot of research on vulnerability.
Mm-hmm. But do you think that research has been there?
It's been there for 10 years at least.
Oh, really? Okay. Oh, yeah.
It's part of the national communication that India gives to the UNFCCC.
Right. Yeah.
It's all there.
Oh, really?
It's not used, yeah.
Thanks for correcting me.
Can we access the information?
Okay, any last question or comment, or we'll just make it break? Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.